Welcome to Future Knowledge, a podcast about knowledge, creativity, and policy, brought to you by the Internet Archive and Authors Alliance. When we talk about music and copyright, the spotlight often falls to the biggest stars. Artists like Taylor Swift, who famously fought to reclaim her master recordings. But what about the countless musicians working on the margins, those fringe musicians who create vibrant scenes without the backing of major labels? What does their experience reveal about how copyright actually works and for whom it really matters? Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Freeland, and I'm a librarian at the Internet Archive. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's conversation. We'll be hearing today from Michael Mena and Anjali Vaught, whose work explores the deep tensions between copyright's promise and its reality in the music industry. Together, they'll examine common misconceptions about copyright, the ways power shapes its use, and what alternative models might lead us toward a more equitable music ecosystem. Here to introduce our speakers and set the stage for today's discussion is Dave Hansen, the Executive Director of Authors Alliance.
Thanks, Chris. I'm really pleased to introduce Anjali Vaught, who is an Associate Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law with a secondary appointment in communication. Anjali researches, teaches, and writes on law, race, rhetoric, media studies, and science and technology studies. She's also the author of the award-winning monograph, The Color of Creatorship, Intellectual Property, Race, and the Making of Americans, published by Stanford University Press. Anjali will be in conversation with our author today, Michael Mena, who many of you may be familiar with. He's done some great work with the Internet Archive before, in particular co-authoring an impactful report on securing digital rights for libraries with Internet Archive's Leela Bailey. Michael is a 2022 grad of Stanford Law, and he recently completed his PhD from the Department of English at Stanford. His dissertation was on Elizabethan entertainment policy in the regulation of Shakespearean theater. So I'm really excited to have both of them take us away, and I'll hand it over to you, Anjali and Michael.
I'm thrilled to be here today with Michael. We're going to be talking about his new piece, The Fringe Musician, the 360 Deal, and a new look at copyright and competition in music, particularly the intersections with some of my work that relates to the themes of musicians, copyright, and monetization. I'm going to jump right in here with the first question, Michael, and say that when reading The Fringe Musician, I was really struck by the overlaps between the work that we're doing and the observations about the operation of law, power, resources in the music industry, as well as some interesting points of departure. Let me start by asking you, what do you see as the convergences and divergences between our work on music, or if it's easier, between your work on music and other scholarship in this space, i.e. copyrighted music?
Wow. Thank you so much, Anjali. It's great to be in conversation with you. I'm a big admirer of your work. I'm also just really happy to be here and speaking with the Internet Archive after having sort of relied on them immensely for this article. A lot of the work that I had to do for this article required going back to editions from the 1990s and early 2000s and using controlled digital lending to do that before it became no longer possible at the Internet Archive. This article couldn't have been written without Internet Archive's book lending services, and I look forward to using them more in whatever capacity they're available to us in the future. But to answer your question about the convergences and divergences between our work or between our work and copyright literature writ large, I'd say that both of us, and tell me if you think I'm wrong, are skeptical about the extent to which copyright laws promote progress within the realm of music. And the Constitution mandates that they should promote the progress within the realm of music because the Constitution tells us that copyright is to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. That's not a unique suspicion among academics. However, I'd say that actually a lot of legal academics are rather skeptical about whether copyright is meeting those aims. It's more important to me that our skepticism, yours and mine, arises not just out of a feeling that copyright isn't adequately incentivizing investment in musicians or isn't adequately protecting them from market exploitation, but from a sense that traditional economic metrics have their limits, notwithstanding their great utility and dominant popularity in legal academic discourse. Your work on the history of racial bias underlying how we measure the production and monetization of IP assets really dovetails well with the point in my article that descriptive statistics, which tell us how much an artist like Beyonce or LeBron James or anyone makes thanks to IP or IP related assets, those sorts of metrics don't tell us how well the industry could work in the alternative. They don't give us a good picture of what the world would look like without copyright. This is important in the most simple sense because we're so often told that the industry and the music industry as we know it needs copyright. But what about the possibility of a better and fairer and more efficient music industry that isn't so dependent upon that legal entitlement? I think that's the reason that I think Taylor Swift is such an interesting figure, because she's entrenching so many of the typical narratives that we're told about copyright and its essential purpose to musicians, but she's also changing the ways that it's used or the ways that artists are typically making recourse to that entitlement or sort of talking about it. And I think that her conspicuous success and her ability to manipulate typical copyright structures is a perfect emblem for how copyright can be leveraged by some to great benefit, but not by everyone, and certainly not all musicians. That was at least my takeaway from your essay, Owning Your Masters, Taylor's version. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today. What do you think about that?
I think that's right on. I really appreciated the way that you highlighted these fringe musicians, as you call them, and the new pathways that they have to engaging with the industry that don't relate directly to copyright. That's a great starting point for thinking about what I think is a really mythic status that copyright seems to hold amongst creators that doesn't necessarily bear out, even though there's this, as you highlight, this group of people that have been able to benefit from quote unquote owning their masters, so to speak. So the essay that I wrote came out of my first book, which looks at the histories of copyright and race. And I'm interested in thinking about how copyright fails to deliver the equity that it implicitly promises or that we want it to promise. The Taylor Swift piece really digs into how her campaign to own her masters echoed those civil rights struggles of Black musicians before her. So Swift was quite successful even before she got into this dispute with Scooter Braun. Owning her masters was icing on the cake for her. Financially, she was set. Musically, she had a huge catalog. That's not to say that she shouldn't have done what she did, but it is to say that a lot of the work that she was doing, in my view, was performative work, pushing back against this man that had bullied her in the industry and wasn't really about the financial bottom line as it is for so many of the artists that you're talking about. So that made me think about, well, is copyright the necessary ingredient here? What else is going on? How does this relate to social media, fans, and so on? I'm also pretty convinced that her strategy was made possible by the struggles of Black musicians that came before her. Prince is of particular interest to me because this is sort of his quote: if you don't own your masters own you, which is obviously a double entendre in this industry context. So he benefited, I think, from coming up in a moment when contracts were in transition. They weren't fully formed in the way that you're discussing in your article. They didn't have this 360 component to them. So I think he got more out of the industry than most artists at time. And then he gets to this point where he accuses Warner Brothers of essentially indentured servitude, of slavery, because they start to intervene in his creative process. And so thinking in that context, both of these artists who are massive global superstars are using copyright to accomplish a thing that's not necessarily even about copyright itself. It's a performative vehicle for the kind of cultural work that they're doing.
Yeah, no, and I think that two really interesting distinctions come out of thinking about Taylor Swift, how she has changed discourse about copyright, and thinking about her in relation to all the other artists of all different races that came before her and were doing a lot of this work or making headway in their individual contract negotiations with record labels, because contracts are by definition, individual, idiopathic, and unique, and they fit the needs of the particular situation, ideally. That isn't to say that standard structures don't arise and proliferate, which is why celebrities in this space have so much power, because they're precedent makers in a certain way. The moment that they make a successful contract, it acts as a model for other artists and their lawyers to follow it and use those models in the future, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. But the other way I think that this is sort of important to talk about Taylor Swift and people like Prince is, and your word performance, is that these celebrities, by virtue of what they do, which is be public figures in the world and in the space, are defining how we talk about copyright, notwithstanding the fact that they're using copyright for their own ends and not for musicians or not for them themselves as a class. And they're affecting not just the industry standards or norms that are going on, but also how we talk about copyright. So copyright for a lot of people in Gen Z or millennials is what Taylor Swift says copyright does, because that's the most that they're ever going to learn about it, because not everybody goes to law school and learns about copyright. So I wanted to ask you a question, which I think is sort of underlying both of our work, which is, what, in your opinion, is the biggest popular misconception about copyright in music, whether it's proliferated by a musician like Taylor Swift or not?
I really appreciate this question as well as the context you laid for it. So many people have come to copyright relatively recently, and so many people have come to it not through the law. So for instance, through social media, through TikTok conflicts, through, as you discussed, the RIAA's piracy campaigns. So there's a lot of different ways people come to copyright that don't promote accurate understandings of copyright. Social media, I think, has really forced public engagement with the topic. And so to me, one of the biggest misconceptions about copyright comes from that space. It's this notion that copyright's going to save the day for creators. So we have this narrative that if these TikTok creators could own their rights, everything would be good with the world. And I don't believe that ownership is the only problem or even the major problem here as it relates to individual copyrights. This focus on owning master records has become really central to public conversations about music, in part because, as you discuss, there are actors in the music industry, rock stars, who have really centered the conversation in that way. I like to point to the example of the show Empire, which actually draws on some of Prince's public comments as a way of integrating a copyright discussion into this hip hop world that they've created. But Swift or even Larry Graham re-recording their masters, that's not a model that can work for everybody. You do a great job of drawing our attention to those individuals that can go straight to their audiences. You talk about Passman's work and the way that it frames some of these new pathways in the industry. The music industry still has a way of maintaining the upper hand, though, with respect to commercialization, even when musicians own the copyrights to their music, which I think is in a self-complicated proposition in the US, given separate ownership streams for sheet music and sound recordings. So even with recent catalog sales by artists like Tina Turner and Bob Dylan, those are practices that a few megastars can practice, but not everyone. I like the way that you force us to think about how the musicians that don't occupy those roles relate to the music industry.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I agree with this notion. And in a way, what we're getting down to is that one of the biggest misconceptions is that copyright works really, really, really well for a very, very, very select few of musicians, and that there are lots of other musicians that practical life experience would tell us that there are more musicians than are famous musicians in the world. I think that we can all agree on that. But and this goes back all the way to the point at the beginning that I was talking about, about empirical metrics or counting of how much money copyright is bringing back to musicians is a way of re-entrenching copyright's dominance in the industry, because only copyright is going to measure that kind of income stream. And there are actually others, as we'll talk about soon, surely enough, that are doing a lot of the same work. I would just add to this idea the popular misconception being about the copyright for a few is that people tend to mistake who typically utilizes copyright and other intellectual property entitlements, not just among the musicians, but between the musicians and their counterparties in the industry. While it's true that these rights, copyrights, vest in authors and inventors, their economic value is typically realized when the author or inventor, or in this case, the recording artist, sells that right to a company that is willing to commercialize it. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it can benefit both parties in the transaction, as we've seen from all the successful musicians that we all wanted to be like when we were children. But as you say, it's a process that's undertaken by the select few artists who are anointed by one of a handful of big, profitable record companies interested in monetizing the exclusionary function of copyright through licensing fees or other means. Record contracts can and often do allow artists to take home royalty rates, but usually only after the record company has recouped its initial investment in the artist through that sale. In my Fringe Musician article, I explained how musicians were once able to maintain other non-copyright revenues in touring and merchandising in full. That is to say, they could sell their copyrights to a record company, but go on tour and make money for themselves by performing their music and selling t-shirts, and that money would be all theirs. But then record companies began demanding other parts of these income streams when they shifted to a new contract structure in the early 2000s, which has since been dubbed the so-called 360 deal, which requires the exchange of all of portions, not entire income streams, in what had once been an exchange only of copyright assets. This is a really important change in the music industry, and it didn't happen overnight necessarily. In a way, it did happen very conspicuously, suddenly in the early 2000s when a lot of these contracts were being inked at the time. But it's not like it was the first time that artists and their record labels had ever thought to contract over other assets, because again, contracts are individual and idiopathic and are going to meet the individual needs of the people who are making them. But the shift is important because we bear witness not just to the alienation of the legal entitlement of the copyright from its nominal benefactor in the musician, which is very normal. When Taylor Swift is complaining about her losing her masters, that was a very normal record contract that she had signed. That was not a unique thing that had happened to her. But we not only bear witness to that alienation, we also see that record companies are using that site of exchange of the copyright entitlement to sometimes extract other non-copyright assets from musicians. So the misconception that copyright is how musicians make money then is doubly qualified by the fact that artists no longer need record companies to record and distribute their work, not like they did in the high-cost physical media supply chain of the 20th century, at least. One of the underlying motivations for my work in The Fringe Musician was my longstanding interest in niche communities, and particularly in extreme metal music, where artists typically have little hope of generating a big enough audience to convince a corporate record label to invest in their work. The moment you start screaming into a mic, a lot of people stop listening, I found. There, we don't just see independent artists striking out on their own, but we also see smaller micro labels that are willing to promote and help in the sort of nitty-gritty work of marketing a record, but they're willing to do that without any exchange in the underlying copyright, the way that it has historically been the case in most ongoing record contracts with the big record labels nowadays. That phenomenon isn't at all unique to extreme metal, and it happens in other communities like ambient music and other sort of less listened to musics, and also pop music too. But I did want to make sure that the published article somehow tipped its cap to that unorthodox inspiration. That's why in an easy to overlook footnote in the article, I actually linked to an explainer video by Scott Heath of the Oakland label Tankcrimes, illustrating just how little copyright can matter in these fringe scenes, which are negotiating and marketing and commercializing and making money off of music. As a longtime lover of Tankcrimes, maybe it's worth playing a bit of that sound here.
So the very first thing to know about a Tankcrimes contract is I don't own any music. I don't own any music. I don't even own my own band's music. I don't know who does. The other guys, maybe. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But why don't I own the music? Because I don't pay to record it. I help with other things along the way, layout, mastering. I can loan a band some money if they need it. But I've never, when I started, I couldn't afford to. And then once we got off the ground, I didn't want to ever put a band in debt. Labels are notorious for putting a band in debt on day one, and then they never get out of it for albums and albums and albums. So I don't pay for the recording, and then I don't own the recording at all. And any band on Tank Crimes could pull their music from me at any time.
That's such a great summary of the music landscape that we're talking about. I want to pull out 2 points from what you said. First is that central theme of how little copyright matters for most musicians in terms of the money they make. That copyright really isn't the thing that allows them to make money. And then the second point that you make about recouping costs seems really important to me, that musicians are often starting with a debt when they sign with major record labels, and they have to repay that debt before they get into the black. So there's this imaginary, I think, amongst the public where these musicians have a hit record, they make a boat ton of money, and that's from day one. And that's not really how the situation operates. Matt Stahl does this great discussion in his book, Unfree Masters, of the way that we imagine the industry. We think of musicians as these free spirits that get to go wherever they want. And the central theme of his book is that they're tethered to the industry just the way the rest of us are tethered to our industries, that the job isn't as free as we would like it to be or how we imagine it to be. And the clip that you played reminds me of a discussion we had in Copyright in Music last semester, where we talked about the ethic of punk and how punk musicians have traditionally not been invested in copyright, or the part of copyright that I remind people is necessary to enforcement, which is cease and desist orders. I want to say it was Hillary Clinton played Riot Grrrl's music as part of her political campaign. There was a push from the fans to intervene. And that's not necessarily in alignment with the punk ethic, but it's very much related to that, again, performance of copyright or use of copyright in a material way. So let me ask you this. We're seeing that copyright isn't necessary or sufficient to incentivize companies to invest in music because, as our clip shows, Mr. Heath is professing a willingness and a successful track record of doing so without explicitly asking for any exclusive entitlement. And even making this complete disavowal of copyright-centric beliefs and ownership as the best means of commercialization. So how do we reconcile that account with our more familiar one, the one that record companies and their artists insist on, that the legal rights are necessary to making and commercializing music? Do you think that those companies are exaggerating their cases and lost profits? And how do you think this fits with our thread of Taylor Swift?
Yeah, I mean, that is sort of the question in a way, and goes back to this divergence between public opinion and the way that copyright actually works on the ground. I definitely think that corporate record companies have, through trade groups like the RIAA, exaggerated the need for copyright to produce and distribute music. I'm not saying that they've exaggerated it for the way that they produce and distribute music and the kinds of bottom lines that they are looking for. But when they sort of say that they're talking on behalf of the entire music industry, they're talking on behalf of that very select few of artists that they anoint and commercialize in their way. They're not talking on behalf of all the musicians that we know in our daily lives, which, again, I'll say, we know as a fact that there are more musicians than are famous and selected by these record companies. That's not unique, though, to record companies. They would hardly be the first corporate entities to disingenuously advocate more favorable regulatory restrictions. You've written excellently about how the RIAA's corollary in the movie industry, the Motion Picture Association, has done the same. And perhaps it's time we thought a bit about how today's excessively long, broad, and punitive copyright entitlements are the results of decades-long lobbying efforts, the same way that lax gun control laws and environmental protections owe a lot to corporate lobbying from the NRA and big oil. In a lot of ways, this is about access to lawmaking, and as much as it is about the technical specifics of copyright. So copyright is not operating in a vacuum. It's operating in a legal system where corporations have a lot more access to the ways that laws get made than individual creators. I do think that the bigger and more interesting question is when we ask why the business of copyright is worthwhile and, from their perspective, absolutely is essential to some music scenes, like the big music scene, but not to others, like the one that Tank Crimes Heath is working in. Is it just that some artists and labels are money motivated enough to leverage copyright where others are not? What is the distinguishing feature between copyright dependent and copyright independent supply chains in music? And once we acknowledge the fact that copyright dependent supply chains are not the only supply chains in music, which is, I think, where we began, and with that public misconception.
This is such a great question of business model. So, the work that you're doing about the RIAA and the discussion in the Fringe Musician about the RIAA's focus on piracy, for me, highlights how one business model has really come to dominate not only the industry, but the public imaginary of the industry. So, the most popular narrative in my mind of the music industry is you sign with a record label, that record label then distributes your music, supports your tour, etc. And if you're lucky, you get the copyright, and that's how music is made. But that is not the only business model. That's the business model that the RIAA has sold in part through its business model of lobbying. So I think we've done a pretty good job of highlighting how all musicians are not created equal. I think about leverage as having something the other party wants and being able to translate that into some type of bargaining power. So we can imagine how certain artists, Taylor Swift or Prince or Pharrell or Kanye, have much more leverage than others. But that leverage is hard earned, and I think in many ways an indication that the artist has already succeeded. That creates this, for me, chicken egg question of how artists build leverage in a context that is meant to deny them leverage. And I think for me, one of the themes of your piece is thinking about alternative pathways to build that leverage and also to build access to these industrial spaces. By the time a lot of the people who were talking about the Dionne Warwicks, the Bruce Springsteens of the world have earned the rights to sell their catalog, they've already made it, right? You don't sell a $500 million catalog after a month of work. The second part of your question about copyright dependent and independent supply chains, I think is more complicated, especially in this world of social media. Musicians are definitely trying to cut middle managers out with recording and distribution technologies. That succeeds sometimes, but I don't think it's a sure bet for anyone. Early histories of music contracts can provide some insights into this. But as you say, sometimes royalties get whittled down to nothing. And so this is really whole industry picture, this question of leverage in my mind. We have to think about all the moving parts and what the take home net pay is for artists.
Yeah, and I mean, the imbalance in leverage and the way that copyright is working for musicians that have already won by gaining leverage and gaining the investment that they needed to get. So copyright helped them. I think it's worth stating that copyright helped them win at the very beginning by making that gigantic sale, getting the promotion that they needed, and then winning. But then the actual sort of cashing in of the copyright happens after a lot of the sort of success has already been had. I'd say that imbalance in leverage becomes only more salient when we recognize that the standard practice of commercializing copyright through the sale to a record company really occurs in a negotiation where one party, the record company, has more power, more resources, more savvy than the other party, the musician. That's what happened to Taylor Swift when she first sold her masters. And again, what was a rather typical record contract. And there's little argument that transaction was immensely profitable to her, whether or not she ultimately regained control of her masters, and whether or not you think that she deserved to regain control of her masters. And what was really novel about that sort of shift was that she realized that she could create an entirely new market for her work by just re-recording her masters and marketing them as her own. That was something that to my knowledge, I don't know had ever been done before. But in a way, that only could happen in the 21st century, where an artist could cultivate a parasocial relationship with an audience that would be more loyal to the artist than to the record company, and could then distribute that music straight to the consumers in that way. So I thought that that was an excellent and pro-artist maneuver, and one that could change the way that record contracts are dealt with in the future. But more concerning and extraordinary than the sale of one's masters in a typical record contract is the way that record companies had used their leverage in these early negotiations to take the other non-copyright assets that I was talking about earlier in the 360 deal. In my article, I discuss that conspicuous shift in the mid-aughts, and I talk about how that shift would not have been possible if there weren't for such high levels of concentration in the music industry and this huge imbalance in leverage at the outset. At the end of the day, even someone like Taylor Swift, even someone as talented and promising as she was in her early teens, she had very few choices when it comes to big record companies. My guess is that she had one or two that were vying for her talents early on. I could be wrong, but it would not be the surprising instance with a lot of these artists early on. And it allows these companies to ask for a lot in these negotiations, and not just the masters of a copyright, sometimes in other assets. I know that at the outset of the 360 deal, Paramore's Hayley Williams was one of the sort of people to advocate its use to her as a teen artist. And she only just released her first independent album off of that deal, which is almost 20 years later. And the idea of stacking options and getting artists sort of in debt and sort of committed in all these ways to the record company through options is only possible because the record companies have all the goods in this particular negotiation. That isn't copyright's fault per se, but the way that copyright is being used by these corporations is happening in a distinctly anti-artist way, in a way that I don't think a lot of people are used to thinking about copyright.
The media scholar in me really appreciates the connection you're making between social media fan base and leverage, the production of music leverage. Taylor Swift connects with her audiences in part by telling stories that are really relatable to them. And her fan base, the Swifties, become such an asset when she is going through this re recording process. A colleague of mine, Nancy Bain, writes about how social media can be a tool for producing intimacy with fans in the music industry. I think that's part of what Taylor Swift excels at, and part of the way that she produces leverage that isn't related to copyright. It relates to copyright in the sense that there's songs involved, but there's very much a parasocial relationship, as you're talking about, that serves as leverage there. So just thinking in complicated ways about the purposes of copyright, I think, is really, really helpful. So let me take us to what I think is a question that's always on people's minds, which is, how do we fix the problems that we're talking about? What does it look like to make a fairer and more equitable music industry? Does that mean we have to make big changes to copyright? Does it mean we should de-emphasize copyright? What sorts of practices can we engage in at a personal and also more industry level to intervene?
Yeah. So I think in a lot of ways, this was the main point of my article, which was advocating a shift from a copyright dominant lens of the music industry to a more competition dominant lens of the music industry, because I think that's a more helpful viewpoint to take. Even if I don't think that they're mutually exclusive, I wouldn't argue that we have to just get rid of the idea of ownership being of value to some people in different markets. That said, I don't see that the inequities in music stemming directly from copyright at all. I do believe that the term length and the scope of that entitlement typically redounds only to the benefit of rich corporations and the musicians that they sign and promote. Again, going back to the idea that those term lengths and those punitive restrictions were lobbied for by these corporations. I do think that we could incorporate principles of antitrust and fair competition into our assessment of the music industry, as I said, in no small part because I think if we were to stop the 360 deal, if we were to enter into a time machine and go back in time to try and stop record companies from using copyright to extract non-copyright assets from musicians, that's not a copyright problem. That's not something that someone could sue in court for with respect to a copyright theory. It is possible, if not necessarily likely, that someone could maybe say that there was an illegal tying arrangement that was going on then, or that there was an illegal collusion between these record companies who seem to have suddenly adopted this new contractual framework, and a bit too suddenly if they weren't talking about it in the background or thinking about how to do it in coordination with one another, which made it especially hard if you were one of those lucky musicians to have two record companies vying for your talents. If they both suddenly ask for this new contract structure, it means that you can't leverage them against one another, to go back to this idea of leverage. I think at the end of the day, the problem requires more than one solution, and largely a discursive one that you talk about de-emphasizing copyright. I don't mean that in a sort of doctrinal sense that we should suddenly sort of advocate that copyright just isn't involved in the exchange of creative cultural products, but more in the way that we see it as the ends and not the means to what we actually want, which is a market that fairly compensates its essential laborers and does so in a way that is efficient and allows consumers to have access to as much good quality music as they might want at any given point in time. And copyright can be a part of that solution. I'm skeptical that certain aspects of copyright have a lot to do with it. I don't know why, for example, there are statutory damages to copyright suits when someone isn't able to prove an infringement actually hurt them. I don't know how that helps make better music. I don't know how it helps anyone but the record companies who are just trying to get as much out of these copyright assets that they've hoarded as possible. I think at the end of the day, I think one thing that's coming out of our conversation is a lot of these problems are bigger than copyright, and they are about the unfair exercise of market power. And that, to me, is incredibly daunting because it means that copyright suddenly gets taken up into a lot of these bigger discussions about the tech industry, about corporate concentration, about the sort of new wave of antitrust enforcement. And I look forward to seeing where it goes next. What do you think? Do you think there are solutions to the problem?
Well, I was really compelled by your discussion of antitrust law in The Fringe Musician. That's partly because I am here in the land of Andrew Carnegie. It makes me think about the robber baron era and just how instrumental antitrust law is in solving practical problems. Amazon comes to mind as another company that is constantly interfacing with antitrust laws. I think antitrust is a really creative way to get at some of the, dare I say, industry hoarding practices that can be traced back centuries at this point. Matthew Morrison has written this book, Black Sound, that explores the origins of copyright law as a function of the need to build an industry around taking certain kinds of music, and in particular Black artists' music. I think if we start to think about industries as living, breathing cultural practices, it gives us more space to intervene and think about creative solutions. You mentioned the piece that I did about the MPAA. Part of my argument in that essay is about lobbying and the ways that it skews industries. Lawrence Lessig, of course, took up that issue after Eldred versus Ashcroft. He points to lobbying as one of the big problems that produces laws that simply don't work, laws that don't represent the people they're intended to represent. So in my mind, that's a big part of why the racial injustices that I trace in Taylor's version were possible in the first place, that certain people were able not only to produce vertical and horizontal integration, but that vertical and horizontal integration made it harder for the people who were able to get a foot in the door, like Harry Pace did with his first record company. It made it harder for them to succeed in the long term. That to me points to the need to think about lobbying and lobbying laws as an intervention. Also, historically, we've seen that without market leverage, industrial freedom and control become really difficult. Those are labor issues. So this might be a place for labor laws. Unions can be a path for advocating for musicians. Unfortunately, one of the stories that Matt Stahl and Funmi Arewa tell about musicians' unions is that they're not always successful. So we have to think about what we might do to help them, support them in being more successful. And of course, to come full circle, Kevin J. Green talks about how central contracts are to music industry practice. So, as you say, copyright matters, but it matters in a context, and that context is often anchored by contracts. How do we make contract law more equitable when we have inequitable parties? That's a difficult question. I think it gets us back to that issue of addressing what produces inequitable leverage in the first place.
I agree with that. And I mean, a lot of the value of contract comes from in allowing people to do what they need to do to reach a solution together. The solution may not come from barring contract law, it could, but I think it's going to come from greater enforcement and antitrust and looking at these markets and looking and calling balls and strikes when balls and strikes are in need of being called. I do think it's worth concluding by taking it full circle back to Taylor Swift and how she was able to leverage her parasocial relationship with fans to sort of enact this change, if not for everyone, then at least for people situated similarly to her. The reason she was able to do that is because, as you said, she could trust we're going to pay for her version of the music and not the other version that didn't belong to her according to a typical contract structure. The one takeaway from that story is that listeners matter a lot and that we have a voice here, somewhat ironically, I guess, and that we can sort of pick and choose which kinds of musicians to throw our financial backing behind or who to support more than others or how to support them going to a show or eyeing a physical record. I think that as much as I have enjoyed Taylor Swift and as much as she wrote the songs to feelings that I was feeling when I was 15 or 16 years old, I do think that it's important for listeners, casual and otherwise, to diversify their music diets and to look outside of the copyright dependent supply chains because their dollar goes a much longer way when they spend $10 on a record by a small local band than it does then when they spend $10 on their Spotify subscription for a month.
Thank you both so much for today's conversation. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the future of knowledge. Be sure to follow the show. New episodes drop every other Wednesday with bold ideas, fresh insights, and the voices shaping tomorrow.